I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Pinkoski.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, we've got a diverse array of topics to get to this week. Will is going to kick us off with an Iran update. I'm going to talk about some of the takeaways from the most recent primary elections. Nathan is going to talk about a new campus safety index, and Inez will take us home talking about the mental state of stay-at-home moms. With that, let's turn over to Will.
All right, so I'm doing an Iran update, which actually ends up being a lot about the Strait of Hormuz, which I think is one of the most under-discussed stories of the week. Is that it looks like we're actually winning the war in a pretty dramatic fashion. And the key statistic that you're looking at is that oil flows out of the Strait of Hormuz, even in the face of a full naval blockade, are substantial. So Secretary Chris Wright of the Department of Energy put out a post that said that I forget exactly what the exact number is. Oh, here it is. About 9 million barrels per day of oil is getting out of the Strait of Hormuz on average. And that's just through shipping. And then there's another 5 to 7 million a day that's now getting out through pipelines. So that's 16 million barrels of oil a day coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. That's roughly around the pre-war average. And that's right now, there is a naval blockade on Iran. So Iran's not able to get any of its ships out, but meanwhile, we are able to get all the oil out. And if you've actually looked at the oil price recently, the oil price, last I checked, was below 80. Okay, today it's at $80 a barrel almost on the button, but it's been like in the $75 to $80 range, which is not substantially higher than it was prior to the war. The people are kind of like underplaying the significance of this. And everybody's still talking about like Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz. Gosh, what are we going to do about Iran? Blah, blah, blah. But like if in a world where Iran is no longer able to meaningfully harass shipping coming out of the Gulf, if the amount of oil that's able to come out, even with Iran completely blockaded, is equivalent to what we had pre-war, then that's actually victory, because you have to understand, like, Iran's general military has been totally degraded. Like, they don't have a lot of capability to threaten. They've just this limited remaining capability to threaten the infrastructure of their neighbors, but they're not willing to use that because they know if they use it, their neighbors will hit their own infrastructure. So there's sort of a impasse there. So the only other leverage they can realistically use is this ability to harass a strait. It's the only capability they have. And the 2 weeks or so strikes that happened a few weeks back where they hit Bandar Abbas, the major port city, seem to have had a really big effect on Iran's ability to harass shipping. Like there was their primary place of operation. If that's true, then there's nothing else that the Iranians are doing. So I've heard a lot of people talk about, I think Compact had some article about the triumph of the Iranian will being, if Clausewitz is right about conflict, the idea that conflict is this balance of will and capability, will and means, then Iran's will hasn't been exhausted. And that's still true. Like, Iran's will isn't gone, but the problem is they don't have the capability to do anything meaningful. So they aren't doing anything to exhaust American will other than try and launch propaganda within the United States to convince us that we're losing. But if they can't stop oil from getting out of the strait, they can't do anything meaningful to inflict damage on the United States interests. And that's despite the fact that we have them under full naval blockade. So you game this out a little bit. You think forward like 3, 6, 9 months, like who knows how long the Iranian regime is just going to hold out and tolerate this continued circumstance. But all that's going to happen is that their economy is going to get more and more degraded, and they're not. And moreover, their whatever remaining ability to harass shipping in the straits is going to become less and less valuable as their capabilities go away, but also as the alternatives to the strait keep getting developed and built out. So I think that it's one of the least discussed stories of the week, which is weird because Iran's always discussed in general in the news, but it's one of the least discussed stories of the week that we are getting as much oil out as roughly as we were pre-war, that a huge amount of oil is going through the Straits of Hormuz against Iranian instruction, and they aren't able to do anything about it. So it's sort of like, I remember there was a few months ago where we talked about Operation Freedom and the convoy effort that got quickly kiboshed by Saudi Arabia. But apparently that just kind of happened, and we just didn't talk about it. And perhaps that's what the Trump administration is doing, thinking that the more quiet everything is about Iran, the better it gets for us, because we're suffocating their economy and they're just not able to do anything to us.
Yeah, it seems like that there's a reversal every so often of who benefits from dragging this out. And sometimes it is Iran, and famously Iranian negotiations are in many ways just a tactic to drag on to essentially prevent catastrophic military consequences from happening to them. But this almost runs the other way, where now we're seeing that there are advantages to the United States for kind of trying to keep this as quiet as possible, but continuing to put pressure on Iran in certain ways that Will laid out. I'm maybe slightly less optimistic than the way that Will laid it out, only because and I'm not a weapons expert or whatever, but it seems like there is a larger trend across any kind of global conflict now. It's very, very easy and very cheap to defend and harass territory. This is the same dynamic that's now, screwing Russia in Ukraine. There's just been this huge sea change in how effective cheap capabilities, drone capabilities, et cetera, can be against much more powerful and expensive weaponry. And for that reason, I think it's probably hard to imagine that Iran will completely lose capability to harass shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. That being said, the thing about a trump card is if you play it and it doesn't have that Trump effect, and I'm not talking about the president, but if you have the same, if you play a trump card and it doesn't actually take the trick, you are really, really screwed, because this is Iran's only card to play, as Will has pointed out. Their conventional capabilities have been so degraded by the U.S. military. This is really the last thing they can do. And if they lose this card even halfway, or if global shipping and global oil markets, essentially this goes on at a low level long enough to make it worthwhile for some of those alternate routes and pipelines to become to gain capability, Iran truly will lose not just its leverage in this war, but its leverage over the entire region in a way that was unimaginable 5 years ago. So I do think that it's still a wait and see situation, as with everything, but this is indeed good news.
So I would echo the point about this is a trump card, but to some extent there's mutually assured destruction associated with it, and the destruction is much worse for the lifeblood of the regime, which is oil money, than it is for us ultimately. So I think the notion that perhaps this new kind of status quo, for the time being anyway, represents the best of a series of unpalatable options for the administration, especially pre-midterm election. And of course, Iran is more than cognizant of the midterms, which could impact, of course, how they respond as well. If Iran becomes sort of a low-level political focus, oil prices remain relatively muted without spikes, and you have the regime getting bankrupted, essentially, that looks like potentially, again, the best of a series of bad options. Now, we'll see ultimately, because there continue to be these talks about some sort of arrangement where effectively Tehran gets control of the strait in one form or another with tolling, et cetera. And I think the notion that there's not freedom of navigation in the seas and freedom of commerce, that we're going to abide that, would be disastrous overall, both symbolically and substantively as well. Let's see ultimately how that shakes out. But I think at the end of the day, from the administration's perspective, post midterms, all bets are off as to what it might do. And so in some ways, the regime, the Iranian regime, is sort of holding an expiring option in some ways. How it ultimately plays out, how it ultimately tries to leverage the midterms, not to mention all of its mouthpieces here, including effectively a legacy media that wants Iran to stare us down, I would argue. All of that is yet to be seen. But to the extent that the regime itself has its conventional capabilities destroyed, its proxies effectively neutered, and let's see about that, and then as well is not able to generate the currency necessary to survive, not to mention just to pay all the people who serve under the regime, that creates major problems for it going forward.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add to that is maybe I take a more pessimistic reading of the situation overall. But I think viewing, if it is plausible to have something like what Ben and Will have described going forward, then that is the least bad option. It shows you can continue to downgrade their military capacity, weaken their regional influence, and maybe be able to to bring about some kind of economic crisis that degrades its power internally. But as Ben said, the Iranians know very well about the presence of the midterms. There are a lot of Schadenfreude in speaking in the legacy media and elsewhere that relish in a prospect of defeat for the U.S., which makes it difficult to assess the situation. But that is part of the political calculation that one has to make in domestic politics. You can debate as much as you want, say, whether Vietnam was winnable in early 1968 after the Tet Offensive. But it did change domestic political opinion, and that did affect how Johnson and how Nixon had to act afterwards. So that is part of the environment that one has to consider. In this case, it is, I think, an advantage in terms of the overall military strategy if a lot of these details remain below the CNN radar, if you will, the CNN threshold for attention. So we will see what happens in the next few months.
So with that, turning to the domestic political scene, there were a mixed bag of results during the primary elections that were held in Tuesday. The three primary states of focus that I'll lay out are Wisconsin, Minnesota, and South Carolina. So in Wisconsin, of course, the big race was between the quote-unquote establishment-backed, quote-unquote moderate David Crowley against Francesca Hung. Crowley himself was effectively out of this race, got pulled back into the race in a bid to save Democrats' prospects for retaining the governor's mansion. And after a series of absurd interviews covering everything from her antipathy to Thanksgiving and a whole slew of other holidays to her mental state of well-being and beyond, David Crowley defeated Francesca Hung 39.8% to 39.3%. This despite the fact that polls had shown Hung winning by double-digit points, up to 20 points, and that she was the odds-on favorite to take this seat. This was not an election night without controversy. Once again, in the Democratic stronghold of Milwaukee County, we had some potential shenanigans late in the night or early in the morning that night, leading some people to speculate about the establishment screwing over the left-wing revolutionary in the race. We'll see if that ultimately is litigated in one form or fashion. But a massive blow to the pollsters, a massive blow to the DSAers, although I think that should be said with a caveat, and I'll return to that in a moment. In Minnesota, you had by contrast, you had the radical left-wing revolutionary Peggy Flanagan winning in the hard-fought primary for the Senate there on the Democrat side against Angie Craig. She won by 20 points. It was around 59 to 39. And then on the Republican side, you had former, I think, ABC Sports and maybe ESPN as well, broadcaster, sideline reporter Michelle Tafoya winning pretty resoundingly in the Republican primary. We'll see what her prospects look like in the general. Same goes for Lisa DeMuth, who was sort of the establishment candidate against Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy, and others who won 43-32 for a Republican governor's race there. Minnesota is going to remain an extremely difficult state, but we'll see if someone with Michelle Tafoya's sort of name brand, name recognition, and fame might be enough to overcome what will no doubt be a challenging Senate race, and governor's race may be even more difficult there, with DeMuth going up against Amy Klobuchar, who's effectively like royalty in that state. Last but not least, in South Carolina, there was the primary for the U.S. Senate seat, now held by Darlene Graham. Graham ended up taking a plurality of the votes there with around 34%. But coming in second was Ralph Norman with well over 20%. And there remains a question in the runoff that happens in a couple weeks of who ultimately is going to take the votes of others who were in that race, like Congressman Russell Fry, Mark Sanford, and others as well. There's a massive vote share out there So it's anyone's guess, in my view, who ultimately wins. Darlene Graham obviously has President Trump's endorsement, so we'll see how far that goes in determining that primary. I want to return to Wisconsin and the kind of broader, quote unquote, civil war on the left, with revolutionaries versus the less revolutionary left-wing candidates. And I think we saw again this trend in Wisconsin of the fact that you have the working class voters, Black voters, and traditional Democrats who are totally rejecting the revolutionaries. But then it's the more affluent, so-called educated or indoctrinated, downwardly mobile folks who are the primary cohort, mainly white, who are the primary cohort of the revolutionaries, which is incredibly telling about where Democrats are. I will say that while there were many among the Democrats who were hailing Crowley's victory and saying, see, they've turned back the revolutionaries in a swing state like Wisconsin, and obviously many on the Republican side who are think this was a bad outcome, and I think it was a bad outcome politically for this cycle. Nevertheless, the fact that the revolutionary and, frankly, the insane anti-American person only lost by 0.5% on the Democrat ticket is extremely telling and indicative of where the Democrats are. If you're talking about the swingiest of swing states, a place like Wisconsin, and the nominee for the Democrat ticket only winning by 0.5% there, a candidate like Hong would have gotten 1 or 2% maybe historically and have been laughed off the stage. Instead, she was the odds-on favorite. She may have lost ultimately, and this may reflect, by the way, sort of the mirror image or polar opposite, I guess, of the shy MAGA voter that, by contrast, on the left, you have the overzealous revolutionary, and for some reason they're oversampled in lots of these polls. Nevertheless, the fact that she only lost by 0.5% is remarkable, and it shouldn't be dismissed or ignored. And I still believe ultimately that the long march of the revolutionaries, including through the Democrat Party, is afoot. It may not happen this cycle, but if they have 5 to 10 DSAers in the next House, that alone is going to be a block that possesses massive power when you're talking about a House that's likely going to have a small majority one way or the other. So I still think that there should be a lot of caution about how we interpret these results, and that the Overton window has shifted in terms of what is acceptable on the Democrat side, and that has changed our perception of it, on top of course, the expectations that maybe these suppression polls have set in the minds of political observers. So with that, turn it over to the group for your takes on any of these races and what the takeaways are.
Yeah, I mean, so the polling, interestingly, I think it got Francesca Hong's support pretty close to correct. In other words, that 40% that she got. What it missed was the opposition to Francesca Hong coming out. And I think that's sort of putting aside whether like polling is itself like a, information warfare or psyoping here. But I something actually similar, as I recall, happened in even the mayoral race, where obviously the DSA took their biggest victory in New York City, right, with Zohran Mamdani. It wasn't totally like the polls were showing Mamdani blowing out Cuomo as the sort of moderate Democrat force. I hate the word; it's hard to describe him that way, but whatever, establishment Democrat force, and he actually came within a few points. It was not a blowout, the way that the polls were indicating. And to me, what I do think there is probably what Ben is saying about the shy MAGA voter, there is probably energy in opposition to the DSA within the Democratic Party that is not being captured in these polls. So that's kind of interesting in terms of I agree with Ben, ultimately the long march through the institutions is happening. But I would just fold it into that entire conversation that we've been having this week about woke 1 and woke 2 and AOC laughing off like woke 1 and all the damage that it did, right? And whether there's any material difference between these two. You would expect the Democratic Party to pivot after the shellacking that it got in 2024 on certain extremely unpopular cultural issues, where they're in the DSA types are in the 20% versus the 80%. That's what you would expect from a functioning political party. It's been very, very difficult for Democrats to do that, in part because all this nonsense about woke 1. I mean, AOC is not going to vote, as my boss has an article coming out, pointing out, my boss is not going to vote to exclude men from women's sports, the most basic 80-20 issue. There is actually no difference in terms of the positions. It's only about how the rhetoric gets positioned, but you would expect the party to back off of certain these things. And paradoxically, what's happened instead is this quote unquote surge from the DSA. And it just shows that there's still a battle against that within the Democratic Party. I, like Ben, have kind of a negative intuition about which direction that battle is ultimately going to go. But it looks like the opposition actually does have more force than some would have guessed. Finally, on the Republican side about the Graham primary, obviously, Trump's endorsement is the most important thing in Republican primaries. What's interesting about that this time around, there might be a bit of a like the Kennedy seat versus the people's seat, if anyone remembers 2010 references anymore, right? I don't think in a populist moment it's a very popular move to just like assign the seat to somebody in the family with the same last name. I definitely think she's going to have to come out and campaign and do more interviews than she has been doing if she wants to secure that seat. I think people feel that it's a little insulting just to have somebody appointed because they are related to the previous person who had held the seat. So I don't know which way that's going to go. I think Trump's endorsement is still the most important thing, but the fact that she has to go to a runoff and that she does have real opposition is likely to like actually force a real campaign out of this. And I think a lot of that is just the indignity of having somebody sort of appointed over you because they're related to the previous person.
Yeah, I have two quick points to make on this. I think it is important for one to see this as an ongoing conflict, and the differences between establishment Democrats and DSA candidates are often cosmetic and rhetorical rather than really substantive demarcations. And I actually think Mamdani is perhaps a good example of that. He's very effective on the rhetorical communication side in terms of the how he speaks, but a lot of the way that he governs, I think, would have been very similar to how an establishment Democrat would govern. Even the things like grocery stores, state-funded grocery stores, are largely cosmetic operations. I think it's not. They're very small in terms of the kinds of initiatives that they have. So it's about tapping into a broader rhetoric, stoking up the criticisms of capitalism and so forth. So we should be wary of exaggerating the differences that emerge between establishment Democrats and DSA. And the Bernie Sanders, I think, phenomenon from 2020 onwards is a good example of that. He very cleverly rallied to Biden and the rest of the party and helped reshape its trajectory. So we expect to see more of that. And yeah, just quickly on the old seat of Lindsey Graham, I would only say that it's a good question going forward for precisely the reasons Inez raises, whether a Trump endorsement in this kind of atmosphere rubs the wrong way, and it's a good way, I think, to see how effective that endorsement will be going forward.
Just as one coda on the so-called establishment, so-called moderates on the Democrat side versus the revolutionaries. Of course, it's worth noting that in recent days, we've seen no less than Chuck Schumer, Senate Minority Leader, as well as presumed presidential candidate Kamala Harris, both come out and endorse Abdul El-Sayed. This, by the way, after Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan, the Democrat nominee for Senate there, himself was a member of the Uncommitted movement, which opposed the Biden-Harris re-election effort, at least originally. So worth noting there. With that, we'll go back to you, Nathan, to talk about this crime safety index.
Yeah, so obviously there's a lot of people thinking about college, whether you're going back to college or whether you have children going back to college. My organization, Center for Renewing America, just released a campus safety tracker, which you can look at directly. The website is campussafetytracker.com. It's very easy to access. And it's really, I think, a wonderful index. A couple weeks ago, we were talking about the dangers of doomerism and people who talk a lot but don't actually note what can be done or what has been done. And the value of an index like this is that it shows you that with a couple policy changes, which are possible, entirely doable, very much within the Overton window, you can dramatically improve safety for students. So just a quick word on how the index works. If you look it up, the index evaluates 161 colleges using 6 different standards, which are public safety or policy indicators, and measures the college from 1 to 20. So 1 would be the lowest vulnerability, and 20 would represent the highest. The 6 standards are whether you see in the county that the school's in sanctuary policies, whether you have 287G participation. That's a program that allows ICE to cooperate with local law enforcement and allows ICE to deputize law enforcement to enforce immigration laws. You look at county crime rates, whether there's a presence of a progressive prosecutor, political attitudes in the area towards law enforcement. So that's effectively measuring if it's an R-leaning district or a D-leaning district, and then student population concentration to determine how vulnerable students actually are. And just to give you an example of how well this index works, if you put in Loyola University, where Sheridan Gorman was killed by an illegal alien from Venezuela while out walking on campus. That scores 16, so that's one of the highest in the whole country for vulnerability. And the key point I want to make in terms of how one looks at this is it shows you that a lot of nationally recognized universities exist in environments that are actually high vulnerability or very high vulnerability. So 86 out of the 161 schools in the index are in the high or very high vulnerability category overall. And this is a data point I think that's invaluable for parents to know, for donors to school to know, and also people involved in local politics. Because as I said, or participating in local politics. Because as I said, there's a couple easy fixes that could be done to lower schools' vulnerability rating. Obviously, you can't stop all crime, but on a couple points like that, you can ensure bad actors with multiple convictions who should not be in the country can be removed. So this is an invaluable data set, I think, for parents and for those in politics to look at and pay attention to, and then they can use that to start lobbying universities or local politicians or law enforcement to change some of the policies that they have. Just incidentally, 287G participation is something that you think would go on in a lot of red states, sort of like you would think a kind of obvious declaration that a sheriff might make, a county sheriff might make, that in a red leaning district that you would work with federal law enforcement and sign up for that. In fact, that's not the case. And that's something that voters should be aware of, Republican voters should be aware of in the districts that they're in, and should be demanding their sheriffs to change their policies, or if they won't, then vote them out during the primary or in the general. So with that, again, the index, it's a wonderful tool that my colleagues have put together. You can plug in your own school or some of the more famous ones, and that's at campussafetytracker.com. So I encourage you to look at it and see how it measures up. But with that, I'll turn it over to the group for comment.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And I think, obviously that's needed for anybody who's trying to send their kid to college. Like, you should be, and it creates a proper incentive for these schools to do things for public safety. I think in some ways, the right is kind of forgetting about public safety as an important issue, which is a little disturbing. There's this huge recent obsession with flock cameras. I also randomly, I talked about this on Twitter, but I recently did a pretty absurd debate with people like Alex Jones, and it'll come out on Twitter at some point. It'll be really interesting. But I think that the big weird point I took away from it is that, there is something on the right that struggles to remember the importance of public safety. Like at one point they put up a tweet of mine that was pro flock and accused me of being paid. And I'm sitting here like, I'm a conservative. I've never gotten paid a dime by flock. I just think that it's like good to be able to apprehend illegal aliens and criminals, and this helps localities do it. So it's good to see, Nathan, that you're working on this stuff.
Yeah, there's some additional things like campuses can do. So mostly campuses are like they're self-policing. Like they have a lot of university campuses have their independent kind of quasi-police force. And they're required to report to the federal government all kinds of crimes that take place on campus. Currently, a lot of universities do not meet those obligations, and they are liable to be fined. I think it's like $50,000 or $60,000 per incident that they do not report to the federal government. That is a tool the Trump administration could use to encourage more aggressive policing on campus. Just generally, we're seeing the landscape, I think, of the universities. This is going to be a turning point for America's higher education sector. Because there's just a perfect storm around them right now. Obviously, the Trump administration's aggressive enforcement of civil rights laws, which is fantastic and long overdue, against them, has put their funding in jeopardy in a way that it has never been before. We have the one big beautiful bill that actually for the first time put caps on free government student loans. The student loan market is almost entirely not private. It's 93% government owned loans. So when the federal government puts caps on those loans, it does actually, for the first time, start to put some pressure on universities not to raise tuition prices in the manner that they have been accustomed to do for the last 3 decades. And then finally, there's just a demographic pressure. So, we are having fewer children, and that wave, essentially the demographic cliff, is now reaching university age. We are going to see, regardless of any of this kind of political stuff, we're going to see universities close over the next decade or two because there simply aren't enough students to fill classes. And that's doubly true when universities are already scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of admitting people that are academically totally unprepared for the work at the university. So this perfect storm, I think, really is going to affect how our higher ed sector looks in the next decade, I think, for the better. And you already see this in kind of the sort of political or half political ideological sense, where you look at admissions numbers from universities that are probably better on Nathan's Index. So, for example, in Florida, right, University of Florida Law School, this round has been able to post LSAT numbers in a T14 range. I mean, they're posting better LSAT numbers, meaning they had a extremely interested class of students with high LSAT scores who, for the first time, want to go to University of Florida Law School instead of, places like UVA or Harvard, because that's the kind of numbers that they are posting right now. So you are seeing a move towards the SECs, towards the South, towards like sort of saner environments where parents do care probably about safety. They care about ideological indoctrination. They care about a lot of Jewish families now care about the safety of their kids on campus and whether or not they're going to be harassed merely for being Jewish. So there's I think a perfect storm of a lot of these different kind of elements that is going to change not only the size of the higher ed sector, not only potentially some of the direction of the higher ed sector, but also within the higher ed sector, which universities are exclusive, which universities are able to get the kind of, extremely smart class with high test scores. And I do think that you're going to see, I don't think the T14 or the top of the index is going to look exactly the same as it more or less has for decades after decades. You can name the top, 10 or 20 schools off the top of your head. I think it's going to jumble around a bit, and I think it is going to be all of these factors feeding into it.
This strikes me as a very useful metric, especially to the extent you have kids who are going to be politically active. And especially politically active on the right. So this is sort of news you can use, I think, as you're looking at all the various factors that go into evaluating where your kids should ultimately go. And beyond that, one interesting addendum to this analysis might be looking at how unsafe are schools that explicitly set aside safe spaces on their campuses. And I bet you the schools that promote the safe spaces come out as some of the least safe schools ultimately. So interesting to see if there's any correlation there. But with that, we'll go back to Inez to talk about a study on the mental state of stay-at-home moms.
Yeah, this is more just debunking a trope that the left has been throwing out there since Betty Friedan published in the 50s. And that is that more traditional families and more traditional mothers in particular are just like a mess. They're running on mama's little helper. They're drugged out. They're alcoholics. They're depressed. They're anxious. Betty Friedan called it the problem that has no name, right? Of all these women asking, quote, "Is this all there is to life?" And so this has really been, I think, a quite effective talking point for the left that has translated into a background cultural assumption. So when you think about housewives and stay-at-home moms, you think about Betty Draper. So I think that's just it's maybe the triumph of sort of the feminist left that has really injected this trope into mainstream culture to the extent that it's one of the first things that comes up to mind when people think about a stay-at-home mother or a housewife. And it turns out that, and it's always been kind of hard to refute because it's pretty fuzzy, right? Like how happy are people? How much meaning do they find in their lives? But we do actually have some data. And there's a new study come out from the Institute for Family Studies, which is Brad Wilcox's outfit, that pretty much flatly contradicts that stereotype, although there are some big caveats that I'm going to mention that are just about the state of, I guess, of women in America more broadly that is depressing. So, being a stay-at-home mom is not like a panacea against a lot of the things that afflict mental health. I hate that phrase so much. It's bloodless, but affect, let's say, the mental status of women in America. But this talking point, which I can, I'll quote, I think Jill Filipovic said very, very directly, and this was like in response to some things published in the New York Times about 2022. Stay-at-home mothers are psychologically and emotionally worse off than working mothers by every measure, from depression to anxiety to anger. They are more likely than working mothers to say they are struggling and less likely to say that they are thriving. And she had some survey data that she used to pretty loose survey data that she used to back up some of those statements. Well, now we have an actual pretty rigorous study to the extent that there is any rigor around these kinds of vague terms. And it shows the exact opposite. And this is a pretty big study. These are conclusions are drawn from a massive data set of women from 18 to 49. So in that data set, you have women who are single, you have women who are married, you have women who are mothers, who are stay-at-home mothers, who are working mothers, so it's just the subset of essentially women of childbearing age in the United States. And what we find is that stay-at-home moms are actually less likely to report having a major depressive episode in the last year. They are less likely to report being on medication for any kind of mental issues, although the numbers, and I'll get to them in a minute, are pretty depressing across the board. Americans are massively over-medicated, and in no sector more than women on psychological medications. But it doesn't appear that stay-at-home moms are more likely to be on those medications, those mommy's little helper type stuff. They're actually less likely to be on those kinds of medications than women of childbearing age writ large. Another one of the tropes, right, is the wine mom that is bored and medicates with alcohol, self-medicates with alcohol, like, again, a Betty Draper stereotype, right? It turns out that stay-at-home moms actually drink less than the average childbearing age woman in America. So once again, we have almost the reverse of the trope that's been pumped out for years. Interestingly, and totally predictably, staying at home as a dad actually increases all of these sort of negative mental valences. You're more likely to be medicating or drink heavily. You're more likely to have had a depressive episode. That probably has to do both with the natures of men and women, and the fact that if you're a stay-at-home dad, oftentimes that means you're unemployed, and men react differently to that situation than women do. In any case, and then finally, the most serious of these stats, stay-at-home moms are actually considerably less likely than other women of that age group to report that they have had suicidal thoughts, right? So even the most extreme kind of negative mental situations, stay-at-home moms are less likely than others to report that. So I think this is worth putting out because, again, that trope has just been ubiquitous in American culture for so long. And it turns out to be at odds with the data. And this data is very much in line with other data that we have, which says that married mothers report the highest levels of satisfaction and happiness. They report the highest levels of meaning in their lives compared to women who are either not married or single or have children out of wedlock. So once again, just not to say that the traditional life is some kind of panacea to human suffering. It is not. There is no magical, set of choices you can make with your life, or that protects you from feeling like your life lacks meaning, or some of these things that are now medicalized as depression and anxiety. I think they're pretty human universals. But in any case, what can effectively be refuted now is the idea that making more traditional choices with your family is somehow makes all those things worse. They don't. The evidence tells us it's the opposite. You're less likely. By no means are you shielded from it completely. And for example, the caveat I wanted to put in terms of psychological medications, stay-at-home moms are still close to a third. 32% of stay-at-home moms report having been prescribed a psychological medication. You're talking SSRIs or antipsychotics or anything else. It's just that 38% of women that are not stay-at-home moms are prescribed these medications, right? So that's not great regardless, but it does not appear, the Betty Draper thing does not appear to be a real widespread phenomenon the way that it's always portrayed in our culture. And I think that's worth pointing out. So that study came out from the Institute of Family Studies. You can check their write-ups over there on this work that they've done. I think it's actually a really useful kind of data point to push out into the culture, just like the data points about the fact that, for example, after divorce, it turns out that the people who are unhappy in their marriages who divorced are much less likely to be happy than those same people who reported being unhappy in their marriages and didn't divorce 5 years later. So you actually see a bifurcation of people who did not divorce and were unhappy, did not divorce, and then report being happy, whereas people who were reported not being happy in their marriages and then divorced, they stay unhappy after they divorce. So I think these data points are so contrary to the message that is constantly pumped, not just to women, but to men, to everybody. These very, very depressing kind of valence on marriage, on motherhood, on fatherhood, on kind of the traditional life within the family. So I think they're worth pointing out for that reason. And I'll turn it over to Ben and Nathan.
Well, that was excellent and wonderfully comprehensive too. I often think that the real enemy in the feminist ideology paradigm, at least as it developed in the second wave period, wasn't men. It was in fact a stay-at-home a woman, the housewife, and that was the one that the opprobrium was really directed at that. So feminism is perhaps best understood as a civil war amongst women, and a downgrading of that role, of that social role, and those who decide to live like that. And any evidence that helps show the contrary, I think, helps us understand the wrong turns that were made during that time, and hopefully it can be disseminated further. And when people are considering the work-life balance, having children, and so forth, they can not be deciding that with the wrong information. They can do as another term that probably Inez hates, but is a good one to have. An evidence-based policy. They can have an evidence-based decision what they should do.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add. These are interesting results, although I think probably less surprising maybe to us and our viewers than probably to Americans writ large. I do think it'd be interesting to look at, in terms of the fulfillment of different lifestyles, how much of this is correlation versus causation would be interesting. But all that said, my presumption has always been that on the average, which is not to say in every case, I'm sure there are some women who what drives them and what fulfills them most is their careers, and they can be okay with their personal lives including building a family, may take a backseat to it. But on the average, probably what has been the traditional family structure and traditional tracks in terms of work versus managing all the domestic responsibilities, that probably does lead to generally happier wives. However, again, I would put in the caveat that it probably depends upon the person. There are probably averages and there are probably tails when you look at the distribution. And again, go back to correlation versus causation, an interesting thing. Sort of like, when we talk about Well, the keys to success are that you don't have children until you get married, you get a high school and you get a college education, you get a job right out of school, et cetera. How much of that is that the people who end up doing those things would do those things regardless versus they made a sort of conscious choice and that ultimately led to the outcome that would have been forecast. So I do think that is worth considering as well in the analysis. But nevertheless, these, I guess, ostensibly contrarian findings are points well taken, and I hope people look at them and internalize them in their own decision making. With that, I'll go over to parting shots, and I'll open it up to avoid any awkwardness with just going back to higher education. Apparently, University of Michigan is going to pilot a program for, I think, thousands of students, first-year students, where they're not going to provide them letter grades. And this is supposedly driven by the fact that people's mental health is suffering under the strain of those grades, the expectations associated with them, et cetera. I just go to a simple point, which is if you wanted to destroy society, what better way than to indoctrinate kids from K through 12 or before and then beyond into leftism, and then to make them soft and coddled, essentially, by not presenting them with the logical outcome of their work and their intellect, which is a grade that is reflective or not reflective of the merits of their work, how hard they studied, how hard they prepared, et cetera. Nothing would do. It's hard to think of a worse way to prepare people for the real world than not to have them get a grade ultimately. It basically keeps them in suspended adolescence. And maybe at the end of the day, that's the point. But building mental toughness, having to deal with the consequences of one's work, good or bad, these are all obviously some of the most basic and fundamental things that you need to be a functional person in the real world. And so what we're seeing here, I think, is ultimately going to do a massive disservice ultimately to the students.
My final thought is on a similar topic, I suppose, as my segment, which is that AOC went viral for freezing her eggs, flirting with her fiance. One is that I would not underestimate how quote unquote relatable that makes her to a lot of women in millennial generation. I really I think coming hard at her for it, even though I am second to nobody in sort of being, I guess, on the conservative side of the sex wars. I think we should be aware of the electoral potential of this kind of oversharing and the path that she's taken. I think a lot of women have taken that path. I think a lot of them are going to end up with some disappointments in their lives that are going to make them double down on their politics in a way that will affect the broader political dynamic of the United States. But just to briefly comment on the thing itself, I mean, this really is a bill of goods that is being sold to women. Famously, the woman who was on the cover of Time magazine for freezing her eggs, was not able to get pregnant with those eggs later in her 40s, the way that she assumed that she would be. It's a very, very low success gambit. And it doesn't, I think it really is selling a false promise to a lot of women who think that they can kind of make that put that decision on ice, so to speak, for another decade, while they're in the thick of either their career or just are ambivalent about having children generally. AOC is 36. Not to say that, we don't wish her well, but in the personal realm, I don't wish her well as a politician, but, in the personal realm, I do wish her well, but this is a very low success gambit, and women should know that, and they should not use this. This is the sort of technology that is, one, somewhat more useful if you are in your 20s, and, for example, have a major health event like having to have chemo, and it gives you a shot. What it does is give you a shot in hell, so to speak, of something that you will lose the capability to do as you get older. It is not a high. It's not just putting that decision on ice for another few years. That is not this is not a successful way of dealing with that. And that's, of course, without dealing with any of the ethics involved in IVF and potentially surrogacy and splitting the idea, the philosophical and linguistic concept of mother into natal mother, which potentially somebody who isn't actually related to the child now with surrogacy, natal mother, genetic mother, and then of course the social act of mothering, which in adoption is split as well, right? So I think there are a lot of ethical consequences, but for now I'm setting those to the side and just saying this is not a high success gambit, and if women are counting on it to be that, there are going to be a lot of very, very disappointed women in 5 to 10 years after they do this.
Yeah, actually, just on that, Abigail Shrier had a few weeks ago, maybe a few months ago, in her wonderful column, Tough Love, for Free Press, she had a story recounting this was a woman writing in about, my boyfriend promises that we're going to get married soon, but he just asked me to freeze my eggs, and I just did that, and I'm just wondering what your advice is on this general situation. And her answer is magnificent in that, not only because of it brings about some of the ethical issues involved in that, and the false hopes that are baked into that decision, but that kind of dynamic in a relationship, and and where the burden is falling. Basically, the advice is get away from this guy as quickly as you can. But I think it's a good piece of advice for those who might have friends in those situations. But sadly, I think this is good politics and does speak to a situation that I think will become much more common and will become probably a feature of a lot of professional relationships in one's 30s. That this will be considered a normal thing to do in balancing out the work-life arrangement and in keeping people up with the idea of that you can have everything at all. I was going to mention Andy Burnham's asylum policies, but that's goes into, I think, a broader well, maybe I should say something about that quickly. I think one of the mistakes that people make when they're viewing Western policies writ large right now is that there's a general trend towards immigration restrictionism, and that's largely because of the actions of the Trump administration. But Andy Burnham has just promised another round of asylum distribution across the whole country. It's actually an old strategy that the Blairites have used since the late 1990s, and you distribute where asylum seekers settle to kind of mitigate the public profile that they have. And it is important, I think, for people to know that is definitely the trend in Europe, definitely the trend in Britain, is to keep bringing more and more asylum seekers in and do policies like this. I read somewhere, this statistic may not be accurate, but that 5% of the German population right now, the population of Germany, is either an asylum seeker or someone who's received asylum. So that's definitely the trend over there. And the US is very much the outlier. And if there were a change in government, I think you would see that trend come right back. So people need to be aware of that so they know what else is happening out there in the world.
On that note, on behalf of Will, Nathan, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten, and we'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.